Welcome to another week, another fantastic packed week of hashtag LDeduchat leadership development in education online. We have a fantastic range of speakers lined up for you today. This week, sorry. Later on this week, we've got Sir David Carter on Wednesday. We'll be looking at succession planning. And then we've got Imperfect Leadership with Steve Mumby. And then we're rounding off the week with Oliver Caviglioli looking at dual coding for teaching. But today, what a brilliant way to start off this week. We have Teresa Kelly from our trust, who is going to be looking at budgets and how we can make the most of our budgets, and especially looking forward now at these difficult times that we've got. How do we make sure that our students and our staff benefit from every pound that the school receives so that we get the best education moving forward? Again, quite often unseen, and definitely something that people that get into leadership realize that is actually at the heart of what we do. Without an effective budget and control of that and managing of that, most of us couldn't do the jobs that we do within our schools. So an absolutely vital role within our schools, but Teresa Kelly does an absolutely amazing job managing the budgets of our 11 schools and beyond, and the support that she gives to all our senior leadership team and beyond. And joining her today, we've got David Graham, who's the head of Puttridge High School in Central Beds. And between them, they'll be answering as many of the questions as possible. Over on Twitter today, we have Freya doing the takeover on the @Chiltern TSA Twitter. Pose your questions, share your thoughts, let people know about this session and the sessions that are coming up. So without further ado, I'd just like to welcome the presentation put together by Teresa and David. Enjoy. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to my session on budget and efficiencies. I'm Teresa Kelly, the Finance Director for Chiltern Learning Trust, and I will be joined by David Graham, Head Teacher of Puttridge High School. He will talk about the efficiencies he's made in his school, and I will concentrate on budgets. First of all, if I start with the Educational Skills Funding Agency, the ESFA, calculates school funding based on pupil numbers. Pupil numbers are taken from the autumn census that precedes the financial year. So, for example, the October 2019 census determined the funding for 2021, and the October 2020 census will determine the funding for 2021-22. Unless there are extreme exceptional circumstances, GAG funding will not be changed in year. So if you have a high number of in-year pupils, it is expected that the school will accommodate their education, and their allocation will not be realised until the following year. If there is a drop in pupil numbers in your autumn term census, you should start looking at reducing your expenditure for the following years. The allocation from the ESFA is called the school's General Annual Grant. Basically, this is the money the government gives to schools each year. The ESFA gives the school X amount of income per pupil to educate that pupil for the year. This is fundamentally a contract between the government and the school. GAG typically accounts for over 90% of an annual school's income. And government are introducing a national funding formula which will be based predominantly on pupil numbers. An academy's financial year runs from the 1st of September to the 31st of August. All academies are required to set a balanced budget, and there is a strong link between your curriculum plan, your school development plan, and the school budget. During this session, I will focus on the link between the curriculum plan and the budget. Remember, schools are not businesses, but they must run on business lines. This is not to maximise surpluses, but to enable schools to focus on their core business, which is to provide an excellent education for young people. However, poor financial management inevitably results in a school not being able to drive up standards. It is important that an accurate and realistic budget is set, and then to ensure that the budget is monitored closely throughout the year. Lack of realistic budget and little budget monitoring will eventually produce a situation where a school has to make drastic and unpleasant decisions to balance their budget. It's very important also that schools know as early as possible that they will remain viable and that they have a balanced budget. Setting a realistic budget and knowing throughout the year how your budget is doing will ensure that schools can forward plan and avoid having to make emergency recovery actions. Each school is required to produce a 3-year budget and to balance for the current year. There is no requirement to show a balanced position over the 3 years, but if the trend is heading towards a deficit, then the school should be worried and should take action. The school must be aware of how it's performing against the current year's budget, while at the same time forecasting how it will perform next year. Remember, budgets are forecasts, therefore income and expenditure is not always going to be 100% accurate. But monitoring actual versus budget would at least indicate whether or not the budget is broadly on track. Schools should forecast a year-end outturn position throughout the financial year, which is presented to their governors. Any budget line showing a variance should be analysed month on month. If senior leaders do not make themselves aware of the in-year position, then it may be too late to consider effective non-damaging action to recover. If the budget situation is critical, senior leaders must ensure that there are processes to enable them to keep track of the situations. Schools must produce monthly management accounts that should provide a basis for tracking that progress. Line-by-line reporting of expenditure needs to take into account both expenditure incurred, that's all the bills that have been paid, and expenditure committed, that's orders that have been placed but have not yet been paid. So there is no misleading of management or governors into thinking that all unspent budget is available. Please remember, finance people tend to be prudent, and our accounting principles mean that income is not normally anticipated, but expenditure is always recognised in its entirety as soon as possible. Actions for balancing your budget will depend on circumstances, but generally steps must be taken to reduce expenditure, boost income, and collect any monies owed. Budget plans must be owned by the school leaders and their school governors. Of course, the budget plan needs to be a real plan, not just a spreadsheet where the numbers show a balance. Governors must be prepared to challenge all of these assumptions that have come from the school leaders and underpinning any numbers presented to them. Benchmarking is a very good tool for managers and governors. It is necessary to know how you compare with other schools. There are good reasons why some schools need to spend more than others. High spending in one school may be expected to meet the needs of schools in a deprived area, or maybe the local labour market requires more spending on recruitment and retention. But if we look at a group of schools with similar characteristics and similar pupil intake, we can see how much their expenditure varies. For example, if we benchmark the per pupil expenditure level for, say, 100 secondary schools, which are all roughly the same size, with similar numbers of children, say on free school meals, there is often a large variation in expenditure between the schools. Always benchmark against schools that have similar characteristics to your own, but has high attainment and progress data. If we look at these school performances, it's often very clear to us there is no direct link between higher spending and higher attainment or progress. Now look at the school income. First one is the main 90% of your income is GAG. This is basically age-weighted pupil unit. In other words, the bums on seats. In next year, 2021, secondary pupils will receive 5,000 per pupil and primaries will receive 3,750 per pupil. The primary will increase to 4,000 per pupil in 2021-22. There are obviously other factors that make up the GAG: deprivation, low prior attainment, EAL and mobility. But these factors will reduce as we move towards the hard national funding formula. At the moment, the local authority has flexibility over how they distribute the funding received from government, but that's always in consultation with their school youth forum. The next area for income is other government grants. This includes high needs funding, pupil premium, and other local or government grants. These are allocated to schools throughout the year, and we categorise these funding streams as pupil-led funding similar to the GAG. The next income stream is private sector funding. This is mainly donations from parents or businesses. And the last one is other income. This category includes lettings. If you've got good sports facilities, this can be fairly substantial income, but it is important not to be reliant on this income stream to maintain and balance budget year on year. If we go into school expenditure, the 4 areas are staff salaries. About 80% of school spending is on education staff, but again, when benchmarking, it suggests that although there is a wide variation between school spending on teachers and other staff, there doesn't seem to be any pattern between this spending and a school's Ofsted rating or their pupils' performance. Schools often have high qualified finance personnel, but these staff can only work with the 10 or 20% that's left in the pot to run your school. Once a school has recruited and appointed staff, there is little the finance officer can do except ensure value for money when procuring resources and services. It is not for the government to dictate how schools should spend every penny of their budget. Individual schools and their local communities know much better how schools should be spending to support their pupils. It's the role of the senior leaders and governors to secure the best value for money and the savings they need through regular benchmarking activities. The next area of expenditure is educational resources. That's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a significant proportion of the learning, admin, and supplies bought in professional services. Supplies and services is the next stream. That includes, the main area in supplies and services is your energy utility costs. Energy is often one of the largest non-staff costs in a school. Schools are using more energy and have been growing their consumption over the last 20 years. So it is an area that you do need to be looking at. Premises is the last one. That is mainly your maintenance and your ground maintenance. Of course, some schools have larger sites and older buildings, and that does affect the amount they need to spend on their premises. But again, with benchmarking, the significant differences in premises across schools cannot fully be explained by the age of the building. So again, benchmarking is an effective tool. The curriculum plan. This is the key action and effective way to make efficiencies in your school and to balance your budget. It's really important to design your curriculum so that you can keep within your budget. I'll go back to staff salaries, particularly teaching staff, and this is where a school should begin when building a balanced budget. But the first step to any budget is the curriculum. So ask yourself this question: is it possible to design a curriculum, staff effectively, that has reasonable class sizes and option groups, and at the same time drive up standards? To answer that question, there's 3 areas you need to consider. Does your curriculum plan meet the needs of the students? A curriculum plan has to have depth, breadth, and is balanced to prepare students for adult life. Is your curriculum plan accountable? For example, with Ofsted, with your curriculum framework, EBAC, GCSE in progress, SEND pupils, high achievers. And lastly, is it affordable? Is it fit for purpose and sustainable? I will now go through, while you're still listening, affordability. Affordable. The 3 things I ask you to consider: cost of one lesson. How much does one lesson cost to a budget? The second area is contact ratio, or with Chiltern Learning Trust, we call it the deployment percentage. And the last one is your curriculum advantage. What are your class sizes? Does that make a difference? I'll start going through each one individually. The cost of one lesson. It is important to understand the cost of one lesson running for the whole year. The calculation is simple. Divide the total annual cost of the teaching staff, including the head teacher and on-costs, by the total number of lessons on offer on your curriculum plan. With the increased cost of employer teacher pension and employer national insurance contribution, CLT has established the cost of one lesson ranges from £2,500 to as much as £3,000 per lesson. So we know every time you run a period or you give a period away, you are giving up to £3,000 away each year, which is a significant disadvantage to your budget. The second consideration is contact time, or as some schools define it as deployment percentage. To calculate the figure, you simply divide the total number of lessons required on your plan by the number of full-time equivalent teachers. CLT's expectation is 75% as a deployment percentage, and the DFE's expectation is as much as 80. A simple way to look at your deployment figure is to think of, let's say you had 100 full-time equivalent staff and you lifted the roof off the school. 75 of your teachers would be in the classroom and 25 teachers would not, if your deployment figure was 75%. The level of 75% deployment figure allows the school to have a reasonable class sizes to drive up performance and could provide school with the surplus to reinvest. Okay, you ask, how much teaching time is reasonable for staff? How many periods would I expect teachers to teach? Well, a good starting point, a head teacher, 9 periods per week, assistant head teachers, 14 to 17 periods a week, head of subject, head of department, 18 to 21, and a classroom teacher, 22 periods. Remember, if you have a 25 period week, the teacher's entitled to 10% PPA and a school is giving away 3 PPA, that is equivalent to 12.5%, which is reasonable for a classroom teacher with no additional responsibilities. When funding was plentiful, gave away a free period to a teacher for many different reasons. It might be for doing a course, it might be for giving an extra period, it might be for a project, an intervention group. There could be lots of different reasons why you'd give away a free period. But remember, every free period you give away costs the school up to £3,000. So a teacher with a TLR of, say, 5,000 and was given 2 periods to fulfil that role would cost the school £11,000 above their substantive salary. What is important to think about is what is reasonable for a teacher to fulfill their TLR role. And of course, remember, you are committed to this cost year on year. It is a shame, really, in education. Often good teachers are promoted out of the classroom when in fact their skill and expertise is in the classroom. We expect senior teachers to use their skills effectively. You may ask again, how do they do their job if you don't give them sufficient free periods? Well, if you go with this scenario, it can work. It will drive up standards. And again, a deputy head with no teaching commitment will cost you up to £27,000 on top of their salary. And that is a huge hit on a school's budget. The third consideration is the curriculum advantage. This is based on class sizes. So, for example, if you have year 7, we'll use year 7 as an example. So the year 7 cohort is 150. Therefore, 5 form-entry with an average pupil-teacher ratio of 30. That would equal a 0 cost to the curriculum and a 0 impact on the budget. Now, if you then have an average pupil-teacher ratio of less than 30, then there is a curriculum advantage, but that is then creating a loss to the budget, so the budget has a disadvantage. If the pupil-teacher ratio is more than 30, then the curriculum is at a disadvantage, but it's an advantage to the budget. Obviously, to have an average of 30 students in classes across all year groups is totally unrealistic and unmanageable. You must try and get that balance. It's very important to get that balance right for your students. There has been known schools normally reduce their class sizes for option groups, intervention groups. But then on the flip side, some schools often keep a 6 form entry at year 7, even if the numbers have dropped, because it's something they've always done. When in fact, they could have had maybe 5 or 4 form entry. Making a higher number of form entries financially is very costly. If I give you an example, if you reduce the entry form at year 7 by 1 entry form, you could save 25 periods. And with each period costing the school, say, 3,000, the schools could save as much as 75,000 year on year. That is why schools should be looking for these type of opportunities and efficiencies. It is a juggling act. It is a balance that has to be thought of, but it can work. It is worth being creative and using any savings in one area to invest, say, in Key Stage 4. You do have to find the right balance between the advantage to the curriculum and the advantage to the budget. And you need to address these three considerations that I mentioned earlier. So in order for your curriculum plan to allow you to drive standards but be affordable, you do need to ensure those three things that I've mentioned: class sizes, deployment figure, and cost of one lesson. And if you think of those and address those and get the balance right, you will meet the needs of the students. You will be accountable, and you will get your accountability framework right, and it will be affordable. Remember, students come first. Therefore, any budget plan must be curriculum-led, not staffing-led. Lots of schools start with the staffing they have rather than the curriculum they have or the curriculum they're designing. I'll now pass you on to David Graham. He's the head teacher of Bedfordshire High School, and he'll talk about efficiencies he's made in his school. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm be available after this session for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Yes, I'm the proud head teacher of Bedfordshire High School, have been for 5 years. We're situated in Luton and we're part of the Chiltern Learning Trust. I've been working alongside Teresa Kelly and her team ever since we joined, so that's roughly 3.5 years. I have to say that I've learnt a great deal from Teresa and her team. I once asked my head teacher, as a deputy head teacher, what I could do, what could I learn in terms of finance, so I'm well prepared to be a head teacher of a secondary school. And he said, you really just need to get the experience. I would now add to that and say that you need to make sure that you have a great finance team to work with, and that's certainly something that I've benefited from, and therefore the school has benefited from as well. I also feel that my background as a curriculum leader has been hugely beneficial. And when I say curriculum, I mean looking at the allocation of lessons against the staffing plan as well. And when Teresa talks about the curriculum plan, we're talking about the number of lessons allocated as well as the staff enlisted to deliver that particular curriculum plan. Hopefully these two videos will demonstrate the importance of cognitive diversity. Teresa and I are exceptionally different from each other, but we have a shared aim, and that is putting the students first, putting their one chance of their education first, and making it a really valuable, enjoyable, but also a huge learning experience, positive learning experience for them, because they have one chance at their education. Our staffing was very, very high. We were 92%, and we knew we had to reduce that to 80%. Our cover budget was very high, probably over 120,000 per year, and our provision budget, those students who were educated off-site, was also around 120,000. All three areas were the areas that I targeted. I didn't look at departmental budgets. They really are quite minor in the great scheme of things. And actually, that's the type of area that I wanted to boost and give more money to make the learning experience more enjoyable and to make it far easier for staff in the classroom. And that's what it's all about for me, is to make it easier for staff to teach and to give the students a better experience each and every day for the work I do as the head teacher. With Teresa, we had some very brutal, blunt conversations. You heard her just now talk about you should be worried. And if you hear that enough times, you start listening a little bit more intently as a head teacher. I shared it with my leadership team, so I wasn't alone, and they knew we were going to have to make some tough decisions, but we were going to do it together. We were going to do it transparently, and I was going to talk to them and the whole staff along the way. We didn't make redundancies, but we did make some tough decisions, and we always put the student first, the learning experience first, and work backwards from there. So we actively look to appoint younger staff where possible. As I said, we didn't create redundancies, but we did have very high expectations of our staff, both teaching and support staff. But I would still say my teaching staff was where was the highest cost, and that was my biggest focus. As we grew as a school, we didn't appoint in line with the growth. And that meant that we increased class size, and so we didn't spend as much that was coming in. We always struggled because we were lag funded, so that was incredibly difficult for us. And really, until we got over 850 children, it was financially very demanding to be efficient. But when we got over the 850 mark, I felt that was a clear line that we needed to get through to be more financially viable. But I have to say that the quality in the classroom has risen as a result of our greater accountability in the classroom, and our results have gone up. We're now at 80%, give or take, and we're very proud, and we will retain that 80% and continue to improve our results along the way. Cover, we're now roughly a third of the budget of 120, we're roughly at 40. I think that this is something that I still want to work on. People always say, how did I improve that so dramatically? Well, first of all, I would like that to be under 10,000. So I'm not proud of that yet. But it was real close monitoring, great leadership, and it was day-to-day monitoring and making some strong decisions around sickness absence, and just watching it very, very carefully, talking to the agencies and driving prices down, and really working hard with the leadership involved in the cover budget to make sure that we were not spending unnecessarily. With regards to the provision, I would say that we just started to stop using the provision in the same way that we used to. We looked internally at our behaviour systems, and we looked to internally support those students back into mainstream education in a much more efficient and rapid way than we might have done in the past. In terms of TLRs and leadership, going back to staffing, we reviewed the TLRs, reduced where we possibly could, made some sort of smart decisions, I suppose, and we looked at leadership and did the same there. We increased loadings across the staffing body, both mainstream and TLR leadership, and that certainly made a difference, I would say. Our deployment now is 75%, which is the trust target, and that's something that we're really proud of. I would say that I couldn't have done it alone. It was great to have the support of the trust team, but also of my own leadership team and the staffing body, who understood that changes had to be made. We had a very, very clear vision. We had great systems that we put into place, and brutal transparency to bring everybody along with us and to make those efficiencies. So hopefully that's an understanding of how we made those changes and how we became a far more efficient school than we were before. We have a long way to go. We have a lot to learn. And we're lucky to be in a trust of over 10, 11, 12 schools now, where we share ideas. And that's been amazing, to share ideas amongst other head teachers, other curriculum leads, and always look to improve our efficiencies along the way. And I know Teresa and I look forward to answering your questions. So that's all for now, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think it was really good to get the perspective from Teresa in terms of, from the managing point of view, and making sure that the key aspects of school budgets are adhered to, but also from David's point of view in terms of almost at the receiving end of this, in terms of the challenges that head teachers and senior leaders face when they're dealing with their budgets. Just to remind you, over on our Twitter, we've got Freya from Rome, who is taking over our @Chiltern TSA @Chiltern TSA Twitter handle, where she can answer questions and share your thoughts. So some questions have been coming through, but just before we start tackling those questions, I would just like to welcome and thank immensely Teresa Kelly to the eStage and David Graham. There's a lot to condense, and as we had conversations leading up to now, there's a lot of information to try and condense down into a half-hour presentation. I think is a really, really big ask, but I think you absolutely nailed that, getting the key messages across. So welcome to #LDeduchat, Teresa.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. Just really want to say, on top of what we've already mentioned, is that how important that curriculum is. Because we're a MAT, we do have 11 schools at the moment, but any school that join us and that in a financial deficit, or the heading for a financial deficit, it is the very first thing we look at, is always the curriculum. You have only, once you've recruited your staff, there's not much you can do with the rest of the money. You can make savings. There is a question about staff absences, and I'll ask David to, because David's made some huge efficiencies in that area. He reduced his cover, as he said, from 100 and odd thousand down to 40. So David's a really good person to answer about savings in staff absences and cover costs. There was a question about the MAT. How do we finance our central team? What we do is we give each of our schools 97% of the allocation, and with the 3% that's left, that is how we manage and pay for our central team. It's very important within a MAT to understand the central services that are on offer, because what we do is we will, as an employer, you have to make sure the finance and the employment law and all of the statutory law is we're on top of that. And the other big area is school improvement. So as an employer, finance and HR, and then to raise standards, we put a lot of our money into school improvement. There was another question about, I think it was about SEN. Notional SEN would normally be through your GAG, and that is based on your October census. So David, if you want to say something about the efficiencies and what you did, the strategies you used to reduce your cover costs, which were quite substantial when you joined us.
Yeah, I think this is a question from Adeli, if I've got that right. So thank you for the question, and welcome everybody. It's great to have such an audience. In terms of sickness absence, a lot of the financial stuff that we did, it was getting back to basics. It was checking the policy, and although we have a trust policy, it was very much in line with the borough policy, the Luton Borough Council policy. So that was fairly simple and straightforward in that sense. And it really was being relentless with the application of that policy and really having a good understanding of how it works and making sure staff understood. So a real transparency, which I've talked about before. We have a fantastic HR, both centrally and locally within the school. And the relentlessness of applying the policy is really quite demanding. The tracking of individuals, and it's not about catching out individuals, it's about supporting them all the way, talking to them all the way, and removing any barriers to them being able to come back to school and to fulfill the expectations of the job, or changing it so that it's more, it works for them in a better way, because in the end we want them in front of children in the classroom to avoid the costs. So yeah, that's the sickness absence really. It was never letting go and keep going and talking to staff all the way through. I don't know, Teresa, would you add? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that it's the leadership of the process that's really important, and then to make sure that you understand the process of staff absences when you go to if you get the right people to negotiate with the supply agency companies and make sure you have a good relationship with them, that all works that's a very efficient way of working, because normally schools find themselves, they don't look at how many lessons they need to cover that day. It might be that they only need to cover 1 or 2, but then they ask the agencies to have one person coming in, when normally they might be able to cover it internally to save that money. That's quite normally very good way of doing it. Try and do it internally first and find out what lessons are actually needing cover. Not just say, oh, we've got somebody off sick, let's replace them, when they haven't got a big teaching load that day.
Yeah, I would say, Teresa, if we're talking about the cover side, I mean, we want to remove any use of agency staff at all. It's not productive for the students. They don't get the best experience. And usually if you can use staff who are in your school, who know the kids, who know the process and the policies, that's far, far better. When we did use agency, when we drove the price right down. It was a dramatic price reduction, because they started to realise that all schools across the country were doing this. But we did look at our staff very differently about who could do cover. And that opened up some interesting conversations, and we just started talking to staff about it, and rather than bringing people in. So that was, we do have cover supervisors, and I think it's an interesting calculation to work out about whether you want to go with agency staff or an additional cover supervisor. And I think that's the sort of prudency that Teresa and I would do in, let's say, April in any year, any normal year, shall we say, to work out what the best way forward for the school will be.
Okay, thanks, David. We have got from Marion Porter a question about special schools. That's a little bit out of my area. How do we benchmark for special schools? I would probably advise you to get in touch with the DFE to find out what is the best way forward to benchmark. There's lots of benchmarking. I know I mentioned it a few times. I really am an advocate for benchmarking. People tend to not live in their own little bubble, and they think, well, we're doing this and we've been doing this for a long time, and they don't look at what other schools, and it's not always looking at the local schools, because they probably might not have the same characteristics, and they probably aren't maybe as good as you. So if you're benchmarking against a school that's not as good and hasn't got as good as results, then what is the point? Because what you're doing is correct. So it's always really important to have a look at schools that are doing really, really well on progress and really well with high attainment, what they're doing. And it's very often it's a good idea to get in touch with those schools. Bring the experts into your school. Say, look, you're working in that area. You're doing very well in that area. Progress is very high. Come and tell us how you're doing it. Lots of schools do a lot of sharing and collaboration in different areas. And it all starts with the benchmarking, having a look at which schools do what. And a lot of outstanding schools have areas where they still need to improve in school differentiations, and then other schools that might not be outstanding, but they still have a lot of very, very good outstanding provision in their school. So it is good to keep working with other schools. Collaboration is key as well, and to know where the areas with benchmarking. Like I said, lots of schools have very often think they're doing something because they've been doing it all the time, but it is very good to have a look at what they're doing in areas where they're exceeding. I don't know what other questions have come through.
Teresa. So Mark's asked about where are the biggest savings and curriculum question mark. Yes, absolutely. But I think that unless you're a head teacher or possibly a deputy, curriculum isn't as simple as just the amount of lessons that are being offered. We talk about the curriculum plan, where we have an amazing spreadsheet, which is balancing the number of lessons offered in each area against the staff, so the need against what's available. And absolutely, Mark, it's all around the curriculum plan and making that work for you as a school. And you can do dramatic things on that particular spreadsheet, which is a sort of a one page, the school on a page, really. And it's absolutely critical. And you know, I know you know that spreadsheet, Mark, but you can make dramatic differences around how you deploy the staff and how many lessons you give to each individual subject. And that's where the craft is. And that's where curriculum is a very creative, and you have to be imaginative and really think deep and share it with a couple of others around ideas. The other question is a really provocative one. It's a classic one that's always thrown at the head teacher. My CEO talks about it, you know, maybe once a month, about how much the head teacher should teach and how much the leadership should teach. But I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about how we do different things depending on where your budget is. So what I did when we were like hemorrhaging, say 500K a year, basically, which is when Teresa and I first started working together, we were hemorrhaging 500, and now we're on an absolute even keel. What I did back then would be very different from what I do now. And I think that's where the craft in managing the budget and managing your staff is really important. That you would do things when you are backs against the wall and in the gutter financially. And now we're more fluid. We're able to release more money for in the classroom. And the craft of how much you allow your leadership to teach, how much you as a head teacher teach, is all down to where you are in your journey. And I think that although Teresa would talk about the cost of a lesson, what was it, £3,000 to £4,000 per lesson, Teresa?
3,000 to a lesson,
You,
up to 3. It could. Some schools are higher than that, but on an average in CLT it's 3,000. But can I just say also with leadership, it does depend on the size of your leadership team. Very often, if you've got a school where you've got a head teacher, deputy head, and say 2 assistant heads, obviously their whole school responsibility is much wider. They have much wider remit. So you have to balance between what you're asking them to do as a leader and also what you're asking them to do to teach. If you've got a very big leadership team and associate, assistant head teachers, then obviously their remit, their responsibilities dilute as the bigger the team get. So you would be expecting them to, they might have a small, although it's whole school, it still might be quite a small responsibility. So therefore you would expect them. So you do have to look at the size of your leadership team. If you've got a small one, then they're less teaching, big one, more teaching. That's tend to how we work with head teachers. But again, it does depend on what journey they're on to recover as well. If they're on a recovery plan, that does change things as well.
yeah, and I was just going to go on to say that we had to balance everything. So we were hemorrhaging 500k, but our progress 8 was minus 0.39, and standards had to rise. So I needed leaders walking the school, as well as leaders in the classroom, who often are, as Teresa said in her presentation, excellent teachers. So it's a balance. And I think you might do different things with different members of your leadership team. The head teacher presence around the school is absolutely critical for people to see me in classrooms, not necessarily with a stick and around accountability, but just to offer that support. And you need leaders doing that as well as leaders in the classroom. It's a balance, and it depends on your journey and where you are at the time. It's not one size fits all, that's for sure.
We have got a question come through that I think David would be the best person to answer as the head teacher, because I do very advisory rather than the doing. There's a question for Yolanda saying about alternative provision. You know, David, how do you decide about sending a child? When you do send, it's a very, very big cost to a school, alternative provision. You know, what KPIs do you look for in a child when you send them to an alternative provision?
Yeah, when I arrived and in my first few years while I was here, when you actually worked out the cost of individual children, you were talking £20,000 to £35,000 for some children who are in full-time provision, and that's just not sustainable and couldn't continue. So we really started to look at our internal mechanisms. It was tough. There were some really tough decisions. But I suppose, ironically, one of the things that's happened is the quality of teaching has gone up considerably. Therefore, the amount of children that staff were struggling with or would have been appropriate for alternative provision reduced, because their experience in the classroom was so much better, our systems were so much better, and our liaison with parents was so much better. So we reduced the number of people who would be potentially looking at provision. We're now looking at provision in a totally different way. And it's very much about getting them ready for mainstream school. We very, very rarely would put someone out full time because that defeats the object. It's around sort of in equestrian terms, long rein, where they go out for a couple of days and spend 2 or 3 days back here, and then reducing that and only doing that for a very short period of time. So it's a very temporary fix where we utilize the immense experience of the provision staff, and we work really closely with them. We're very selective on which provisions we use. We're very, what would you say, we negotiate the cost of the provision itself, and we're always looking for mainstream. And if it's not working, yeah, I have permanently excluded children who have not been able to absorb the support, both from the school and provision. And if it's not right, then the bottom line, we have permanently exclude. It's the last resort, not something I wanted to do, but we have used that. Because in the end, we have to look at the experience of all the children in the school. And if it was your child, and £40,000 was being spent on one child in alternative provision and not going to the main body of the cohort, then we've had to look at that very carefully.
Can I just jump in there very quickly? Freya has just put one of the questions that she's found online. It's from Acorn Teaching School, and it's about primary school budgets are the most challenging. What creative ways can primary schools reduce costs? And we're quite fortunate. We've got a whole mixture of schools within our trust. So from a budgeting and managing point of view, we get a taste of everything. From middle schools, primary schools, lower schools, and high schools. So what are the creative ways that primary schools can reduce costs, to either one of you or both of you?
Again, I would say a very good way is to encourage young teachers come into the profession. So you have a core middle management, so that you have a turnover of young staff coming in. That's a good saving. What sometimes happens in primary schools is they don't have a big turnover. It's good to have a turnover of staff. It's not great to have it continue having a revolving door of staff coming and going. That's really hard work. But very often in primary schools, they get the teachers come in and they stay in that school and they progress within that school, and then they become very, very expensive. Whereas being part of a MAT, is always good that when you get outstanding teachers in primary, there is a progression. They can go to others, but a primary school, very often you've got a small leadership team, and then you've got these teachers that are expensive, but there's nowhere for them to go. When they're in a MAT, they can move on. Then you can get the young teachers in that are less costly. So as long as you've got a good core middle layer, middle leaders, developing them, and then when they get to a stage, they can move on and work in other schools, different types of schools. That is a great saving, rather than keeping the same staff all the time. Being in a MAT is very beneficial for primaries in saving money, because their staff can move on and move around, and then you're not left with very expensive staff. That's probably the most efficient way of working for a primary school. There is a question also about governors and trustees. The DfE is hugely focusing on governors and trustees with their budgets, making sure that they are very, very aware of where the financial position of the school. When you have Ofsted, the governors are very often asked about finance. They want to know what kind of accountability that they put on the school, how they hold the head teacher to account for finance. It's got much, much more rigorous in making sure that governors do understand that. Governors should be, we have a template now where we'll be asking governors when they see the budget plan, that they're asking the right questions to the head teachers, making sure that they know exactly what the teacher and the head teacher knows. This is how we've built the budget. This is what we've looked at, and this is what we've come up with, and this is where we're going to make our savings. But governors really do need to be very, very challenging, because halfway through the year, you do need to know if you're still on track. If you're not on track, you want to and governors need to make sure they get the data from the software rather than from a spreadsheet. It's very easy to manipulate a spreadsheet and say, yeah, that's okay, that's okay. And then at the end of the year, oh, sorry, we've actually spent more than we thought we would. So it's really important that trustees and governors really are aware, and that they link with the finance people, so they know that everything's on track.
I think that's a really good point in terms of linking with, especially within MATs, where you might have central finance teams, for the governors for the schools to actually link directly with you to get the information that they need. I think that's really valuable. Having been in that situation myself, it really, really helped talking to the people that are actually dealing with the finance and managing the budgets, rather than relying on staff through their mechanism getting the information to me. So yeah, absolutely. I think we've got time just perhaps for another couple of questions, if you've got anything that you've seen on there.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions. One on, Stephen asked about CPD and the commonality across the 11 trust schools. I think that's a really good one, Stephen. I mean, I've been in education now and a teacher, senior lead of 27 years, and only in the last 3.5 since I joined the Chiltern Learning Trust have I seen head teachers, deputies and leaders and teachers work across schools. It's amazing. It's the real deal at the Chiltern Learning Trust, and it's amazingly rich in terms of the opportunities. For me as a head, I'm incredibly fortunate. I mean, last night we were talking about wider opening, and I was sat talking to 4 other head teachers. I mean, what an opportunity for me. My head of PE can talk to 10 other heads of department. My finance team can share practice. It's an amazing experience, and we save hugely on behalf of the school. We save money, and I know the trust saves money by utilising the strength and depth of the experience across the staffing body, whether that's support staff in HR, in science technicians, or whether that's for NQTs sharing their experience of their first year to students who are looking to come into the profession. It's a real opportunity for all of us in schools at the moment. There's 2 questions, I think. One's quite a topical one. One's around the deficit, so I'll go quickly with that one. So how long, I think it was Alexandra, you asked about how long would it take to turn around your deficit? Well, Teresa's brilliant, but it really would depend on how large your deficit is and your school situation. For us, it took us really 3 years to get to a good position with Teresa and her team's support. And when we talk about Teresa's support, she does work alongside a very strong trust team, and we got brilliant curriculum, standard support. Adrian, the CEO, who's been a head teacher, been in my position for a long period of time. His manipulation of staffing was also really, really valuable. But it took us 3 years. And then the last question, Teresa, is around top slice.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the one I was going to finish on. But I just follow on from what you said, David, about deficits. Very often schools get new head teachers come in and they inherit staff that probably hasn't got the same vision, doesn't have the same culture that the head teacher. Everything comes from the top in the school. Every single thing permutates from the head teacher. And if the head teacher comes into a school and the staff don't have the same culture and same vision, same ideas, then sometimes that's not the right school for them. And very often restructuring's a big area to be able to make efficiencies and to reduce your deficit. You know, some head teachers have different ideas about what areas important and what areas and how they use their TAs and how they want their TAs to work in the classrooms with teachers. And another head teacher might come in and say, actually, I can make more efficiency in there. But restructuring is normally the very first start to make your provision more efficient. So that's a big key one to reduce deficits. Is we always start, unfortunately, with restructuring, and you have to be brutal in some cases, because that is how you balance your budget in lots of ways. When staffing is very high, if you're spending 80% on staffing, it can be very high and very costly. The last thing that I'm going to is about top slice, because the top slice, unfortunately, that's how they pay our wages. And I have got a very, very strong team. They all have the same views that when they go out to the head teachers, they all use the same strategies, they all give the same advice. We do a lot of brainstorming, we do a lot of work with the head teachers as a team. So I'm very proud of them, but we do have to be paid, so we don't do it for free. So when you come to the top slice, it does depend on, we've got to show that we are value for money to a head teacher. You know, we do a lot of backroom functions, we do a lot of work behind the scenes, but when we're with head teachers, it's no good us just saying that, you know, you're not making any money, you're making a deficit, this isn't, your budget's too low, you're spending too much money. Unless we can work with them, unless we advise them, unless we say that these are the different strategies you can use, then we're not doing our job. We can do all the spreadsheets, we can do all the data processing, we can do it, but unless we work with them and say, yes, we have to, and we are finance, we are prudent, we do have a very tunneled vision, but we have to work with the school, we have to work with the children come first, the education comes first. but we have to support you in making sure that you have enough money and your money works for you and it's value for money to be able to drive standards. So we do have to, we think that the 3% that pays for our team. It also pays very much about our school improvement team, which are excellent as well. And again, we have to be seen to be doing our job, because nobody likes to pay for something that they don't think they're getting a good return on. If they're not, they're investing their money and they're not getting a good return. Head teachers, they won't want you around. They think, I don't want Teresa visiting me because she just talks rubbish and I don't get anything from her. I don't want her team coming in. I don't want the school improvement team coming in. We have to make sure that we're credible and that we can do our job. And it's the same HR. We are the employer, so we do need to make sure that we work with the head teachers. And I don't think across the board, the average for top slice runs from about 3% to maybe 5-6. Some mats actually still charge 9%, but there again, it depends on what's on offer. The other point about top slice is we are basically a family. So you have schools in our trust that are very, very good. They still pay 3% of their budget, but they might not get as much support as another school that's come into our trust that still pays 3%, but they need a lot more support. But that's where we try with our schools that don't need as much support. They do understand that, and we use those schools to support schools that need help in certain areas. So that's how, although they all pay the same money or the same percentage, they do get slightly different services. But that is an understanding when you join a trust. If you've got areas that you need support in, we'll support you. But if you have areas where you don't need so much support, we won't be giving you them because we think that you're on track. And that is the understanding. When any school join us, they have to understand that's how it works.
Yeah.
It's a school down the road, they see the school improvement team in there much more than they see it in my school. But that's because your school doesn't need the support that this other school. And it's all about children. It's not about individual schools in our trust. It's about the children that we have to educate. That's kind of really what I'd want to say about the top slide.
30 seconds or not?
You've got 30 seconds. We are over, but I'll give you 30 seconds. Okay.
I think, Teresa, you put that really well. You made some of the points about what's in the 6%. That's critical, because actually it might not be such a big deal once you know what you're paying for. But I would align it to my first 6 months, a bit like my first 6 months of Sky Sports subscription. You question it, you think, is it value for money? And then after 6 months of being at Chiltern, I never talked about it again. It was a non-issue because the value we were getting was greater than the 3%. I'm now questioning, as an Arsenal supporter, my Sky Sports subscription, but I'm certainly not questioning my Chiltern Learning Trust subscription because it's good value for money.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm not even going to go with the Arsenal. But anyway, you were okay up until that point. So I'd just like to thank immensely, first of all, David, for being part of the session today. And Teresa, phenomenal. I think somebody tweeted online, you've actually managed to make a session on finance engaging and interesting. And actually,
I did think that somebody was going to put a comment, isn't this boring? But
no,
unfortunately, finance can be boring.
Well, yeah. But I think in terms of what you've covered today, and also the honesty behind it as well. And I think all of our sessions up until now, one of the key comments has been how honest and refreshing they've been. And I think today you've been really honest and really refreshing. And I'm really hoping that people that haven't had much to do with their finance teams within their schools, that they do reach out to them and actually find out more about what's going on within their schools and supporting each other. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of we operate as a family, and sometimes siblings need more support than other times, and you're not going to begrudge your sibling getting the support when they need it, and actually you'll jump in and support as well. From that point of view, a brilliant session, Teresa. I really, really do appreciate it. A valuable input into the whole series that we've got, and I think it would have been a miss for us not to have covered this, and you've done it absolutely amazingly. So thank you so much, Teresa. for your time.
Yeah.
Which just leads me on to, that's our first session done for this week on finance, on budgeting. We had Teresa Kelly and David Graham. If you've got any requests for resources, etc., we are looking at what we can share, and we'll let you know in due course about this particular session. And I think one of the things that encapsulates this session, as well as everything else, the aspect that's come through is actually, if we're looking, especially from a finance point of view, is that collaboration is one of the ways that you can really, really maximize the money that you spend. And whether you're part of a MAT or whether you're part of a group of schools within your area, and actually now thinking about, doesn't matter where you are, you can collaborate with schools that align with you to make sure that outcomes in all of your schools actually improve. So collaboration has got to be the way forward, and do not lose the spirit that everybody's had over the last few weeks during the lockdown and what we're going through at the moment. And when we return to the next phase, whenever that happens, of reopening our schools, that we end up back in our little silos in our schools, in our little bubbles, and don't reach out. Us as the trust, we do reach out. Even schools that are not within our trust, we do reach out and support when they need support. And I think that's so important moving forward, because none of us know what the future is really going to look like. So this is me, Arv Cowshaw, signing off for another session of hashtag LDeduchat, Leadership Development in Education Online. And I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday with Sir David Carter. Thank you.